All right. So welcome everyone to a session on the Kurdistan freedom movement. So when I got asked to come today, there was sort of an explanation of things that we needed to talk about. Unfortunately, I just want to start by saying that this is obviously a very limited amount of time, and a lot of detail is not going to be covered in this. So we will be making kind of broad historical overviews, but there will hopefully be an opportunity to share resources afterwards, I'm sure. And instead of having a framework of me just sort of doing a seminar, which is often quite dry, I would like to have quite a lot of engagement and a lot of questions and a lot more sense of what people already know. So maybe we can start with this. I mean, some of you have already kind of said a little bit, but is there anything people already know about the Kurdistan freedom struggle that they want to share?
Dual power.
Dual power.
Yeah.
Is that in reference to the co-chair system specifically, or this kind of like overview of dual power, like self-governance?
Overview of the way in which system is supposed to operate. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Anybody else? Any words that spring to mind?
Yeah, so I mean, in Bristol, we have a particular connection with Anna Campbell. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with her. I mean, my vague knowledge, and I'm hoping people will correct me, of course, is that it's the largest people group in the world, or certainly one of, without a homeland, without genuine independence of their people. And I know that there's enormous diversity within the Kurdish people, and within their culture, within all kinds of things. So yeah, I know that there's a lot more complexity to it than simply, what's going on in Rojava, and even there, there's a lot of diversity, a lot more than I think people would necessarily think on the surface. But yeah, I'm really hoping we can explore that a bit more.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think like one of the first things to note is its kind of position in the world, right? In Western Asia, Kurdistan is actually now, since the Sykes-Picot Agreement, I'm sure people have heard of here, which turned into the Treaty of Lausanne during World War One. Kurdistan was divided into like basically crossing four borders of nation states. So Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, southern Turkey. And they're actually called things in. So you'll hear about Rojava, obviously, because this was quite a well-known part of Kurdistan, but that just means West Kurdistan. So you'll have Bakur as well, which is the top half. You'll have Rojalat in Iran, and then also Bashur, which is the Iraqi side of Kurdistan. So you can imagine from this moment, there was already, I mean, we can go even further back, but the Kurdish population, like you said, has been divided from this moment and very much has struggled to gain its independence and gain unity across these kind of four nation states, and has always sort of been caught in between very strategically by international interests, caught in the middle of wars and economic oppression. So this is kind of where we can imagine this struggle actually begins, this kind of heart of Mesopotamia also, right? This history of like humanity and the first civilizations, or some of the first civilizations between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So very kind of what they call the Fertile Crescent, a very fertile part of humanity, is then being divided by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And then we can make kind of a parallel today in the current moment of this year to see how this like division is happening again, right? Like Western Asia is going through another very violent transition and division, which the Kurds are yet again caught in the middle of. So some kind of brief, very broad stroke overview of the history of KFM. It actually had very humble beginnings. So I'm sure everyone's heard of the PKK, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party. which is kind of the absolute beginnings of just literally a few friends in Ankara University in Turkey organizing around this, what we call like the Kurdish question. So the question of a national identity, a question of, at that point, very, very inspired by Marxist-Leninist theory, actually, in the beginning, to kind of fight for a Kurdish independent state. Now, obviously, this had, not obviously, but basically there was a huge paradigm shift from this kind of state structure to what we now know in Rojava with the autonomous region to be a fight for a completely stateless, like democratic socialist society. And this paradigm shift actually happened during, has everyone heard of Abdullah Öcalan? The kind of leader of this, you can sort of nod your head. I can see some of you.
Sorry.
You haven't. Well, this is why I want a little bit of engagement, just to know where we're starting from. So this group of students in Ankara that I'm talking about that formed the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party. One of the kind of driving force of this was an individual called Abdullah Öcalan, who is now actually imprisoned off the Turkey. He's in a military prison, basically, off Turkey in Imrali. And this is because of this, like, really determined and like dedicated work that they did in these like former years. So the PKK was kind of formed in the late 1970s, but there was a lot of social movement in the 80s as well. And this kind of came up on international, like, nation states, interest, basically. And he kind of proposed this idea of the Kurdish independent state to, other international actors around the world, and that got a lot of traction and consequently led to his capture. So he was actually captured by an international conspiracy by the NATO states in '98, and he's been in this prison ever since. Often he is completely alone and isolated on this prison island, and he has like very limited access to the outside. And despite this, he's still regarded as the leader of the Kurdish freedom movement in so many ways. I know this kind of word means a very different thing maybe in our context, but in terms of if you were to go to any of the kind of like what we call Well-Up Paris, which is like the families who are kind of the social foundation of this movement, even just like around the world, anywhere in the world, they would always have a picture of Abdullah Öcalan in their living room, which actually, funnily enough, he criticized himself in a letter saying, look, I'm not sure about this famous kind of identity. He doesn't kind of relate to it at all, but he understands why it's existing, because he was kind of the first one to say that, Kurdistan is a colony, actually, and dedicate his whole life to this struggle. And he was born in Turkey as well. So international roots. So essentially what happened was, while he was imprisoned, he was obviously going through an extensive trial. And part of his defense writings actually became the manifestos for the Kurdish movement and were kind of taken out of the prison, smuggled out, and translated into many languages. So currently 3 of them are in English that you can actually buy online. And essentially what he was doing was he was like gathering, like in those first years, he did a hell of a lot of research with these friends to understand the kind of like the sphere of socialist movements throughout history in relation to the Kurdish context, and really kind of synthesized the kind of good and like all of the good parts of it, and then critically analyzed, obviously as well, and came up with this synthesis and solution to this Kurdish question, which had this paradigm shift of not just a state anymore, because he came up with this very, very extensive an amazing analysis of the nation state and what that means. And it even goes down to kind of say how that's affected our personalities, how it's affected, you know, from the macro to the micro level. And this is the new proposal. So this shift into democratic socialist organization, which we'll touch on a little bit more in detail in a bit. But I just thought I'd pause there, see if there are any kind of questions or like clarifications. Yeah, so the Rojava Revolution is what we're going to kind of talk about a little bit more today, because it's very relevant for the current situation of this sort of reshaping of the Middle East that's going on. So Rojava, as I said, means like the west of Kurdistan. So it's actually in northern East Syria. And it is an established like semi-autonomous zone of governance, and there's an like autonomous administration associated with that kind of replaces the state completely. And so Rojava didn't just spring out of nowhere. Obviously, when we talk about revolution, we're not just talking about like one moment or one day. We're talking about something that's been built up. Well, this whole entire movement is almost what's over 50 years old. So there's a hell of a lot of organization on the ground. For example, I always like to note how Abdullah Öcalan and about 200 cadres during the 1980s actually escaped like the military coup in Turkey that was happening and got themselves into Syria. And they did quite a lot of the kind of foundational social organizing in this period. And what they did basically was to go into tribes and villages and into society, and they just knocked on people's doors and they sat down with like mothers and grandmothers, like particularly, and just heard, you know, and listened in the start, you know, and kind of held so much dedication and interest to really understanding society's situation that it made a kind of like, you know, a ripple effect, shall we say, in society, and really kind of made an identity for them as well. So on that kind of contextual backdrop, and also the backdrop of obviously many struggles happening across this, like these four nation states, Rojava kind of comes out of, you know, the people's uprisings, or what people call like the Arab Spring, in the kind of 2010 period and 2012 period. And this is obviously, this was like a global phenomenon. People were really watching this worldwide because obviously there was the threat of ISIS, and there was this really kind of like visceral struggle and violent struggle between these ISIS leaders and like these autonomous women's people's defense forces, you know, and there was a lot of traction worldwide to support this women's revolution, and it became a reality internationally in that moment. And it became a beacon of hope, you know, for something that could really be, you know, a replacement of the nation state structure. When they established what we say, there's a lot of, it's a bit of alphabet soup in the Kurdish movement, but essentially the autonomous administration is written down as Danes, usually in articles. But yeah, this administration started to kind of replace, in this vacuum of like power, it replaced the governance that was existing, and really tried to work with another organization called PJAK, which is more like union organizing and really kind of pushing forward like grassroots democracy. In this kind of, in these two like administrations, one was kind of like TEVDEM is sort of like the people's voice, holding like the autonomous administration like accountable, essentially. Because one of the main things that we have in the nation state structure is like complete impunity, right? And you always need, like, what they're representing is like, you know, there's always power held in the community at the commune level, and the commune level could be a street, it could be an entire village, it could be non-geographical as well, it could be based on like the needs of that area. And that really is kind of the foundation of this organization away from the state structure. And Rojava exists within what that's called as a proposal from Abdullah Öcalan. What I was talking about in his defense writings is democratic confederalism. And essentially he's proposing this as an international solution to global capitalism, right? And it's not at all a blueprint. It's something that's kind of pushing forward this idea of autonomous like administration, complete participation, like pluralism, a real like a push to kind of participate from every level away from the state structure. And we can really see how, it really gets us thinking about how this could exist in other spaces, right? Because there is a hell of a lot that's going on in grassroots organizing, especially in the countries of Britain, but maybe it's not unified in the right way, or maybe we just don't have the right approach. I'm not sure. Maybe we can talk about it later. But essentially, this proposal is kind of held up by these ideological pillars of women's liberation, social ecology, and grassroots democracy. So these pillars are the absolute kind of heart of it, and women's liberation is always a priority and is always at the forefront. So, and this is something that really, I guess, really inspired me when I got to know this movement, because it was something very unique. I'd never seen this kind of leftist movement really kind of prioritize women's liberation at the forefront, and not just like a promise afterwards, right? Like there's always this thing of, okay, yeah, after the revolution, we'll like make sure women are free. And this really kind of says, no, this is what's going to drive it, because if you look at any women, like the situation of women in any society is an absolute representation of the health of that society, right? So it's very integral. So another thing that really inspired me about the Kurdish movement organizing in Rojava was, like I'm saying, like the heart is the commune level. So you'll have like the communes, and then those communes will come into an assembly, and then through those assemblies, committees are formed. But everything is like there's power in the ground level of those small communes to kind of make decisions, and that to be passed up all the way through. And some kind of key points on this in terms of the like structure of how they do it is which are completely necessary and have to exist, are based off these pillars that I'm talking about. So there's always a co-chair system of a man and a woman leading any kind of institution or organization, and there's always 50% social participation and political participation of women in all these areas as well. And those things are an absolute necessity, which leads us on to like the threat of today, right? And like what's happening in Syria at the moment. Are people kind of following what's going on in northern East Syria a little bit since January, or?
I'm still a bit confused, but I don't think it's a good sign. But I heard that the communes basically just gone underground, as it were. I mean, not literally, but they're still operating, but not officially. Is that correct?
I think what's important to kind of say is there's a real kind of existential threat on women in particular, as you can imagine, but also generally just of liquidation of the successes of the Rojava Revolution. So it's also important to note, just really briefly, like what's happened in this period of like the last few months, but also the last kind of couple of years, is the current Syrian transitional government, who's led by a person called Jalani, was actually trained, like he was a affiliate of Al-Nusra, which is like the Syrian Al-Qaeda front. and he was actually trained by like a British NGO called Intermediate, which Jonathan Powell runs. So essentially, our work recently has been to kind of reveal this news even in its basic form, because actually on the ground here in the countries of Britain, it's been the media blackout's been complete, and yeah, for obvious reasons. So yeah, and there's some really interesting images of it. I always find the images really like powerful, like of Jelani kind of like before, when he had this sort of $3 billion like bounty on his head for being a terrorist, and then this kind of like opposing one where he's like in a suit and he's cut his beard and he's shaking hands with Macron. And I really think that like kind of image speaks to the current situation globally today, and how much like nation states are kind of getting away with. It's actually quite transparent, but internationalism and being informed about these things is kind of a really important push at the moment, because it's very, very easy to not see what's going on. So yeah, essentially what came out of Rojava and what's in threat as well is this kind of social contract. As you can imagine, like when you're establishing like self-governance and you're organizing society, not just like society who's already connected to this movement, but like civil society, who perhaps before, you can imagine the contradictions with like people that had a lot of money before the revolution, and then suddenly they're saying, okay, we're going to have this organization now, and maybe you won't have the same amount of things as you had before. There's a hell of a lot of work that's being done to educate and organize like civil society to really kind of push this like strong ideology. But what came out of that and those conversations was this kind of social contract for like multi-ethnic representation, gender equality, linguistic freedom, and the abolition on kind of successes are also what's at threat in this current stage. And I want to talk a little bit about, zoom in on the communes again, because another thing that really inspired me when I was looking up the communes for the first time in Rojava was the self-defense commune. So, and like you'll see a lot of the images of it today, because in this last few months and this kind of escalation of war in Syria, like what's really shone through is how like civil society has organized themselves and taken up arms in the communities to defend themselves. So there's like a theory that's quite nice behind this, like an ideological theory around, we call it the theory of the rose. So the rose is like this really beautiful thing, right? But it's also like got these spikes on it, and it has its own like natural self-defense. And so, within the understanding of like the connection of nature and humanity and this kind of like theory of the rose, there's always a push for like self-determination and self-defense in the form of like, completely voluntary as well, a lot of the time, like organization and civil society. And I think that's really amazing, especially when we think of like how difficult that could be to really, even in the face of like violent oppression and war, to really say you can convince everyone to fully participate in this kind of defense, on every level, is quite an achievement. But an image that really sticks in my mind, unfortunately I couldn't find it for this, or maybe there's one, but it's not the exact one, right? Like I shared it with you, Lucky. So the acronym is like HPC. Oh, he's loading it now. Yeah. So I just think this image is so powerful. Like a lot of the voluntary self-defense groups, so this is like it's in Kurdish, the acronym, so it's Hazem Palestina Javaki, which is just like the society's defense forces, basically. It's like a lot of like elderly women and like grandmothers in society just like getting on with it and organizing themselves, and not getting paid for it either, like spending their hours and their energy really kind of sharing their time to defend their community. And they really, really rose up and were kind of like a driving force of this kind of threat, like this year as well. And another image as well that I always think of, and I couldn't find it, but just to kind of like say about this kind of intergenerational struggle that it is like all of the, I used to have this image of like, really inspired me, of all of the grandmothers like standing by themselves like with huge rocks, waiting for the Turkish army to go past, because obviously in their families there was a lot of martyrs and they really wanted to show the Turkish army what they thought of that. And it reminds me of something a friend used to say to me, which is like when I used to live in Bristol, when there was this kind of like uprising against Kill Bill, and we were talking about this riot, and the friend said, well, it's not a real riot unless your grandmother is building a barricade with you on the street, right? Like, it's not real change unless everyone is participating in it. And I think that's something that's really important about Rojava as a kind of beacon of hope. It's very much an intergenerational and requires like full participation in every walk of society, and that's what makes it so strong. Yeah, I would love to kind of have like a session where people have thoughts and reflections on what's been spoken about, especially in terms of like what we think about it in our own context here and our own organizing here, and what we can really be inspired by. Yeah, if anyone's got any thoughts and reflections on that.
I'm very sorry I was late. I was just going to say that the Communist Party had organised a meeting in relation to Iran recently. And what came out of that was that it was very much the Iranian grandmothers were also organising. So there's definitely a common theme there. So that was my contribution.
Yes, you can imagine in Rojava it's been quite difficult. Like a lot of the time, when we speak about the Kurdish movement and its history, we're talking a lot about Bakur, like southern Turkey, and we're talking about Rojava, but actually in Iraqi Kurdistan and Iranian Kurdistan, the threat of oppression has been so much that it's still clandestine in a lot of ways, the organizing, or it's still in this kind of like phase of building the new world inside the old. But yeah, it's really amazing to see this as well. I've been watching this.
Well, I'm a grandmother as well, so.
Yeah.
And I have to say that at this precise moment in time, I am definitely feeling very radical, because something's got to give, because it's never been this bad in my lifetime. That's what's happening here. So yeah, there's like nonnas of the world unite is what I would like to say, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
No, I feel very much the same, yes, and it's quite inspiring seeing those grandmothers and in defence groups. It's no excuse, no excuse for me, and I do feel sort of radicalized at the moment. So yes, I've gone to a few demonstrations, which is something I haven't done for ages. So yeah, I think it's really important for us to be there.
Absolutely.
Could we make some? I mean, unfortunately, when you speak to general public people, if you haven't heard of the Kurds, they immediately associate they immediately think that the Kurds are just one political party, one political program, whereas in fact there are lots of them, and there are conservative, quite Islamist Kurds, and there are the regional government in Iraq, which is not very progressive, to put it mildly. And then there are the another annoying thing is that they keep on changing their names. So it was Rojava, and then it became ANANES, and I don't know what that means. And then
just to speak on that, it's
and then the HDP in Turkey, which is a party which I knew about, suddenly changed their name as well. So it is it's all like this.
Yeah, it's quite often a kind of response to oppression, right? To have this strategy of changing a name in terms of like organizing in the legal sphere. But in terms of Rojava, it was mainly it's had a lot of progression over time due to its like expansion of diversity as well, and its organization, especially in like the Arab community. So now you have like Arabs, Assyrians, Yazidis, Kurdish, like all of these people trying to work through this democracy together. But yeah, I think that's a really important point, like that you say when people haven't heard of the Kurds, they think this, they think one like ethnicity, one identity, one flag maybe as well. And that's, what's really strong about the Kurdish movement in its ideology and analysis of society is like this really like in-depth analysis on how the nation state personality is really, really rooted inside all of us. And so it's quite often like the first contradiction people have. I held a discussion in Sheffield not too long ago, and this was predominantly the quote unquote leftist space, and one friend put their hand up to say, well, isn't the nation state like what you're talking about? Isn't that its job to unify and things like this? So maybe it would be worth starting from there, because the Kurdish movement does that very well, is like make this distinction between nation and nation state, and how nation state is pushing forward this like hegemonic agenda of like one nation, one flag, one thought, and in global capitalism also just like a real push of liberalism as well, right? Especially like economically, but also just like within our personalities. So something that like is really powerful for me is remembering a friend who actually got assassinated in Paris, I think in 2013. Her name was Sakina Jansis, and she was like one of the founding members of the PKK. So she was like the first woman in the Kurdish movement to really kind of organize women and then be a part of that paradigm shift of women's liberation, being a driving force for the movement, and did a lot of good organizing, both in Europe and also in the mountains in Amsterdam. So I had like a really kind of idealistic view when I met these people, and I thought, my goodness, like I've read these autobiographies from Sakina Jansis, we call her like Sarah. Wow, like I'm meeting someone organized with her. This is crazy. And I thought that they would tell me all of these like tangible achievements that she made, and really kind of like big her up in this like material way. And actually what they told me all the time was about her characteristics and the way that she held herself, and the way that, when she was going into the families and doing like social work essentially to organize society, she was like really warm, really open, a great listener, and really kind of like showed the way in terms of like how to hold yourself in what we call like in the movement like a militant way, which I guess is kind of like has its own context again in our like meaning of it, but in this context it's very much about like discipline and determination and being like really kind of embodying your politics even in like the micro level. And she's always been kind of a leader of this thing of like the struggle always starts from within, actually, and if we don't start from there, we're always going to make the same mistakes and create the same systems of power wherever we go. So yeah, she's definitely worth looking up, and her books are incredible and very accessible as well. Like, I mean, she she has it's basically reads like a diary, so it's like really you skip past like the kind of alphabet soup if you want to in the first few pages, but after that it reads very easily like a diary, and it's a really beautiful story of her struggle. And a lot of it she wrote actually because, as one of the friends was mentioning earlier about the 1980s like prison, a really like powerful prison protest and like death fast that happened in the 1980s that kind of coincided and was inspired by what was happening in Ireland as well at the same time. She was there, she was in the Amed prisons, still organizing and being like a leader of the women in the, because you can imagine like in a militarized prison like that in Turkey, like you have this gender divide already. And she was like, yeah, I mean, she's famous for like spitting in the face of the Turkish soldier, like, and all the women behind her were like, wow, wow, okay, like let's stick with this one. Like she's yeah, she's very determined. So yeah, she's really worth looking into in terms of further reading. Very, very inspirational woman. So got a few more minutes. Has anyone got any other reflections, or we'll kind of like go into a close?
So I was going to say, well, just thank you. That was just amazing, Ronnie. And yeah, we can include any recommendations in the YouTube video when we upload this as well, for everyone to check out more about this, extremely important thing. But I'd say you asked the key question in terms of how does it relate to us here? What can we learn about how we need to organize here? And I think this is extremely powerful because in many ways they've shown us the way. We don't have to kind of learn from scratch. They've done a lot of the work for us, a lot of the trial and error, a lot of the listening. And, the role of leadership, the comrade you just spoke about, I think is really important. And, yes, we're all forced to be radicalized, but we do have to take it upon ourselves to be inspired and to be like this militant comrade that Ronnie described. But also this question of community self-organizing and self-defense groups, I think is extremely important for us in Britain. And in Bristol, I think most of the comrades are from Bristol here. I think we need to take this question very seriously and really start to think about not only how we can defend ourselves and organize ourselves, but how we can be better at being members of the community. And again, Ronnie, you outlined that beautifully in terms of, a big part of that is looking inside and, really digging deep and being really critical of ourselves to see what it takes to be what is necessary. Because that's our historic task, is to do the kind of things that they are doing in Rojava.
Yeah, and I would say like that is coming from like a very defined and like deep analysis on like almost 5,000 years of patriarchy, right, as well. A women's revolution couldn't exist without this kind of analysis and historical input. And there's also even like a science called genealogy that's come out of the Kurdish movement that is pushing forward like a holistic women's science as well. So a true kind of social science, and a way of looking at knowledge, in this kind of grassroots way, and archiving and revealing a lot of history that's been like erased, especially in terms of like the erasure of women. So where you can really see all the kind of like intricacies of this research coming together, but in like a tangible way as well. Then there's actually like a project in Germany that now has been like kind of taken over, hopefully, by a few friends in the countries of Britain as well. And this like they talk about it in the movement of like revealing your history in this way of like the two rivers, so the Tigris and Euphrates. But the two rivers, in an ideological sense, are like the democratic history and then the capitalist history. And where we really need to start is from the right history and understanding that like these two rivers are always flowing like parallel to each other, and they're always existing in the same moment as each other. But we have to remember that there's always resistance, even if we can't see it, even if we don't know it yet. There's always been resistance, and I think through that, it's like what really inspires me is like this movement is a movement of like rebuilding like trust and hope. And what's pushing it forward really is not only this embodiment of like internal struggle and like social change in our personalities as well as like externally, is like a lot of humility, you know, like which is really lost when we think about like systems of power, globalization, patriarchy, you know, this kind of humility and the ability to like disagree with each other, but also create diplomacy from that is really powerful. And I think something that, you know, right now is kind of really necessary, actually, especially like in England, where there's this kind of resurge of reform, right? And like also like a national kind of socialism coming out of that. And how we can kind of counteract that in our day-to-day lives is to like really come at these conversations with a lot of humility and a lot of understanding, you know, on a human level. That there's a reason why people believe things, and you know, we have to work with a philosophy that people can change, and it's our kind of responsibility as internationalists and as people that have the privilege to know what's going on in the world, to translate that, you know, for people in civil society as well. So yeah, the work has to start with ourselves, but also this kind of like understanding of society's situation, and especially the situation of women. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. And I know we didn't, sorry, just to say we did do huge overviews today. So if anyone wants to keep in contact as well as the list of resources, I'm happy to like talk to people and like do more of these kind of sessions in different ways.
Fantastic, thank you. I just wanted to say, what you just said at the end there, Ronnie, you know, I've heard that before in various movements. You know, as soon as you started talking about the inner journey first, you've got to almost go into your own soul and your own search for the oppressor within, if you like.
Yeah.
You know, and it made me think of Steve Biko in South Africa. And he said that. He said that, you know, this is back in the 70s, and, you know, in the Black Panther movement, all these movements, it's like you've got to shrug off that oppressor inside before you've got any chance of looking at it externally. And I loved what you said. I mean, I loved it all, but I really loved what you were saying about humility. You know, because I think that's it. I think we live in a society where we're told what to do. This is what it looks like. This is what you've got to achieve. And actually, what really matters is that connection with your neighbour. And you know, and we're trying to build something from the ground up. You know, and you said about that woman, that comrade, who you were expecting. You know, she flew across mountains and all of that. And actually, what she's remembered for was how she could connect with people.
Yep.
And that's what makes the difference. Yeah, gorgeous.
Yeah, I remember just like a really quick anecdote as well on the thing of I guess decolonization, and like really as a white person, like putting yourself in these situations where you are a minority and how important that is sometimes. I like spent a few months in Iraqi Kurdistan, and we weren't allowed to leave the house that we were in for the 4 months because of security. and I was living with a couple of friends who were younger than me. They were in their 20s, and everyone there was Kurdish. Nobody spoke any English, and these two friends had come from like the villages in Bakur, and they'd gone straight to the armed struggle, and they'd never even seen a European city before. They'd never even seen a city, really, which was quite an incredible difference to be living together. But I remember one day, like so clearly, that I really reflected on a lot, was we were basically, because of the heat and the fact that you couldn't get, there wasn't much to do and things like this, and there wasn't much soil. We were essentially like growing like plants as much as we could just to keep ourselves occupied and also connected to nature. So there's this like small balcony with a lot of plants on it. And one day the friend turns to me and she says in Kurdish, like, do you know that plants don't survive without water? And I was like, it's a bit of a weird thing to say. Like, it's obviously, like obviously they don't survive without water. And then I kind of thought a bit more about it, and I thought, where's this like emotional reaction I'm getting? Why am I trying to defend myself and my knowledge here? And she said, well, not everyone does, like this is a huge privilege of knowledge, actually. And also the fact that I was feeling like, I thought it was really interesting that I was feeling this kind of patronizing feeling, right? And that etymologically does actually have like a connection to patriarchy, right? Like patronizing, looking down on someone.
Yeah.
And this is not actually existing when you meet these kind of friends that have experienced the struggle at the forefront. Like they don't understand this word. They're like, well, of course I didn't mean that. Like I'm speaking to you like as an equal. I'm speaking to you as a human being, and I'm making a genuine like curiosity here and posing a genuine question. So that was one of the small moments that really stuck with me as well. Yeah. So it's 7:30 now, 31 minutes past. Do we want to do like a short checkout round? How people are kind of feeling after this? Any reflections or thoughts? Yeah.
I'm feeling really grateful, actually, for you coming along and talking to us. And I'm keen to get like a reading list or pointers to places to look up more. I'd like to research more. And I just want to thank you. Thank you so, so much.
Do you want to pass it on?
I'll pass it on to Jane. Go on, Jane.
I'll just reiterate what Linda said, really. I'm just really grateful, and I just need to do some reading and know a lot more. I'm sort of ashamed to say I've been sort of quite ignorant. I know some things that have been going on, but not nearly enough. But yes, and thank you very much.
Who's next?
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. That was really good. As I say, there is a lot of misinformation out there about the Kurdish movement and stuff, and for instance, you get people saying in the left as well. You get people saying, "Oh, they're in league with the Israelis" or something like this or whatever, and So have you got any ideas of how to deal with that sort of stupid stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of moving parts at the moment, and that's quite hard to keep on top of. And of course, there is going to be a lot of propaganda on all sides. And I think that, yeah, what's important to take from what's going on now is that this kind of role of the Greater Middle East Project, facilitated by the US, and then pushing forward like Israel as this like hegemonic center of the reshaping of the whole of the Middle East according to international interests, but especially the US. So of course, Kurds are going to be in the middle of that. When you, I can put a link to it in the resources, but in terms of Rojavat's position, there was a statement brought out not too long ago from the kind of like Kurdish movement organization in Rojavat, basically saying that despite the kind of absolute and real and violent threat that is kind of being pushed forward here, there might also be an opportunity to push forward something democratically. And essentially, you know, and we can talk about this in another session because we're running out of time now, but in terms of the kind of like more global kind of proposal of democratic confederalism is called like democratic nation, which is essentially like a proposal for a commune of communes. But essentially what it means is there will be an even bigger like diplomatic push to kind of have certain relationships with each other and push forward democratic diplomacy on a level that does actually represent all the colors of the different regions. So yeah, I can put a link to the statement because there's an English version of it, but yeah, what's happening in Rojava is hopefully a vacuum, such as where Rojava was brought out, hopefully a vacuum for something similar to be built up. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Ronnie.
you. Take care, everyone. Thanks so much for coming, Ronnie. Thank you, Lucky, for sorting it out. Thank you.
We'll get the
Thank you for
resources
sure.
emailed to everyone. But thank you for coming.